The first major decision you'll have to make in Dragon Age the Veilguard is which class to play. As you level up, you'll start filling out your skill tree and choose a subclass to specialize in. So, what's the right path for you? This guide will help you make all the right calls for your particular playstyle. There are 3 basic classes in the game, and each one of those classes has 3 further subclasses or specializations of their own. That means that by the mid-game, there are 9 total paths that your character could take. In this video, we'll do a brief overview of each class, as well as the necessary skills you should get first. One quick note, you can respec your skills at any time, so if you've already begun with something that's not working for you, know that you're not locked into that path forever. Keep in mind you can also mix and match skills from any class specialization to your heart's content, though it may take more time to get to their best skills if you don't focus on your own points. Now let's dig into the skill trees. Moving from left to right on the selection screen, we'll start with the Rogue. This is the most mobile class, intended for players who want to dance around the battlefield and poke at enemies' weak points with ranged and melee attacks. If you're a melee player who'd rather dodge attacks than tank them, consider this option. All 3 Rogue specializations utilize mobility in different ways. Duelists get up close and personal, Saboteurs leave traps around the battlefield, and Veil Rangers attack from a distance with charged up arrows. What unites them all is their ability to play tricks on the enemy, with skills that prioritize doing damage over time. If any of those sound like how you want to spend your adventure, then the Rogue is absolutely the class for you. All Rogues start with the same loadout and ultimate, Concussive Barrage. They can also hurtle electricity at enemies with Static Strike. From there, the skill tree is open to whatever perks you want to pursue. There are a few basic skills that every Rogue should grab, and the number 1 is Riposte. Rogues are tricky fighters, and being able to deliver a counterattack is an absolute must. Second, you'll want to get Evasive Maneuvers, which combines your extended dodge with a nimble attack. You'll be dodging a lot as a Rogue, so make the most of that by poking at enemies in between their attacks. After that, you're going to want some AoE options. The coolest one on the Rogue skill tree is Hurricane of Blades, which deals damage to enemies with a slicing tornado. It looks cool, and it's great for crowd control. On the flip side, Pilfer is a good option for one-on-one fights and if you're playing on a harder difficulty. Not only does it detonate a primed enemy, but you'll also steal a potion from them and immediately use it. This can be especially handy in a tough fight, and it's a skill that doesn't rely on you building momentum. Rogue specializations are available after hitting level 20, but if you have one in mind earlier than that, there are some additional skills you can grab beforehand that'll get you headed in the right direction. Duelists prefer to fight opponents in close quarters, and Toxic Dash helps with that. Not only does it close the distance between you and the enemy, but it also sunders them. Explosive Daggers is another great way to single out an opponent, hitting them multiple times with a targeted attack. The Saboteur is a trap layer, zoning the battlefield to get the upper hand. Explosive Trap is the obvious early skill to grab here. That's kind of the whole deal with this subclass. Reign of Decay is a great AoE option though, as you can bring down necrotic damage on a group of enemies from a distance. No one gets more distance than the Veil Ranger, however. This subclass is all about peppering your enemies with charged up arrows. Reeling Bolt weakens them with electricity, while Lightning Quiver can hit a whole group in the same shocking way. Grab those ahead of time to get yourself an early start down this path. Now, if you're a melee fighter who wants to deal big damage while taking it, then you need to check out the Warrior. This class has high strength and defense, making it the best choice for your typical tank build. Plus, they can hurl their shield across the battlefield like Captain America, and that's just cool. Melee is the focus for the Warrior, and each specialization wields their weapons in different ways. Champions wield the shield most aggressively, defending against enemies before bashing them with it. Reapers use necrotic damage to steal HP from their opponents, and Slayers focus on heavy two-handed attacks. Generally speaking, the Warrior is for players who aren't concerned with looking too pretty as they beat up the bad guys. Warriors have high attack and defense, and they start the adventure with the Flashing Fists ultimate attack that pummels opponents into the ground. They can also knock enemies back with a diving kick that shouldn't be taken for granted. Beyond that, there are certain skills that every warrior ought to know. Right off the bat, you need to grab Shield Volley. Throwing your shield like Captain America is a staple ability of this class, so being able to do it repeatedly is a priority, especially when attacking enemies with barriers. After that, you'll want some options for crowd control. Titan Stomp is a great AoE, and it deals big stagger damage to anyone it clips, as well as inflicting Overwhelmed, meaning rogues can then detonate it. There are also 2 defensive maneuvers you should add to your list. Counterblow is a counter-attack triggered after perfect defense, and it pairs perfectly with the timing of a 2-handed weapon block. It's a really good idea to master this if you're thinking about choosing the Slayer subclass. But if you'd rather summon some magical shields to do the blocking and countering for you, then Spectral Bulwark is the way to go, as it doubles as a way to knock back enemies that are closing in on you. Let's talk about subclasses. Even though they don't come into play until later in the game, it's a good idea to start buffing yourself for whatever specialization sounds good to you. For example, the champion uses their shield for both defense and offense, even while keeping it at their side. Plus, they have fire magic. You can get that fire going early by grabbing Fury of the Forge, which brings flaming arrows down on opponents from afar. Then you'll want Grappling Spear, a fiery harpoon that stabs enemies then yoinks them over to you. It's the perfect setup for a heavy shield bash. You'll want to focus on champion if you really enjoy timing parries and want to buff your teammates at the same time. The Reaper uses necrotic magic in place of fire, and that necromancy lets them steal health from their enemies, as well as providing a damage over time status with necrosis. Deadly Ground is a good zoning attack that infects enemies caught in its range, especially when you activate this node that makes duration abilities apply necrosis on impact, letting you wail away while the necrotic damage does its job. And it has some fantastic rage boosting buffs in the nodes around it to boot. Bloody Advance impales enemies with little necrotic blades. While they're stuck on the blades, you can follow up with additional melee attacks. Bloody Advance also applies Sundered, which means mages can detonate right after, and enemies who are impaled cause an AoE burst to others nearby when you hit them with a shield toss. Finally, we have the Slayer, whose weapon of choice is the heavy 2-hander that all warriors carry on their back. I wouldn't call this subclass graceful, but it is a little more focused on movement than the other two, and it excels at dealing stagger, making takedowns more easily available. As such, Tumbling Blades is a good warm-up skill to get, since it gives you a swift attack when coming out of your dodge roll. Whirlwind is a powerful ability if you don't mind spending 2 pips of rage. This spinning attack clobbers anyone in your path before you bring the weapon down for a final devastating blow. Also, to replace your starting kick, we have Heroic Leap, which detonates weakened enemies, takes just 1 pip of rage, and counts as both a strike and smash attack, meaning you get all the benefits elsewhere on the skill tree for both of those attack types. Finally, we come to the Mage. If you want to cast the strongest magic in combat, the choice is obvious. Mages aren't afraid of the Fade. They reach right through that veil and use its powers for themselves. While there's some debate between Rogue and Warrior on the melee side, the Mage is the one and only option for pure magic. And that's not a bad thing. Mages can specialize in one of 3 subclasses. Deathcallers use Necromancy, Evokers prefer Ice Magic, and Spellblades have a unique style that blends their long-range casting with an in-your-face dagger for a taste of melee action. If you want to be a spellcaster, specializing in a mage path is easy. All you have to do is choose which school of magic sounds the coolest to you. Every mage can use Arcane Bomb to stack light attacks and then deal big explosive damage to the enemy. That's true for everyone who plays mage, but there are some other basic skills you should grab as soon as possible. The first one is a gimme. Mortal Concentration lets you sustain your ranged spell attack, and since you'll mostly be fighting at long range, you'll have plenty of opportunity to use it while your opponents make their way toward you. If you want to blast enemies who get too close, then make sure you grab Chain Lightning, which shocks multiple targets. Even if you're fighting at range, you're going to want some defensive maneuvers too. Mages have access to a pair of excellent options here. The first is Mind Blast, which you can fire off as a counterattack while defending. It's a great way to get enemies off your back. The other option is to not let them get that close in the first place, and that's where Wall of Fire comes in. Enemies will take damage if they step through it, so even if they keep marching forward, they'll be weaker by the time they get in range. You know by now that subclasses start in the mid-game, but it's a good idea to lay the groundwork for whichever school of magic you want to focus on earlier than that. For the Deathcaller, that school is, predictably, Necromancy. A good precursor to this is the Corrupted Ground skill. It weakens enemies by creating a zone of necrotic damage. Not only will it hurt them over time, but it'll also melt through magical barriers with increased damage. If you want a more direct approach, Meteor is a good place to build off of Wall of Fire. The titular meteors can also detonate a sundered enemy upon impact. It's not necrotic, but it is effective. Next up is the Evoker, for anyone who wants to be an Ice Mage like Nev. The obvious early skill to get here is Frost Nova, which deals ice damage and freezes anyone caught in its blast. For a more targeted attack, you should also choose Ice Blast. With these two spells, you can freeze multiple targets or pick them off individually with flying icicles. The last subclass is quite different from the others. The Spellblade is for mages who want a great mix of melee in their combat. They can cast with an orb in one hand while stabbing the enemy with their dagger in the other. Mobility is important here, so Fade Strike is a must. That skill will set you up for a quick attack after dodging. Following that, you'll want to grab Storm Surge. This lightning spell doubles as a backstep, putting more distance between you and the enemy if you need some breathing room. And with that, you should have no problem narrowing down which class is right for you. The same goes for subclasses and starting skills. And while you can't change your overall class, you can respec within your individual skill tree at any time in the menu. Feel free to mix and match our recommendations here to discover your own style. But if you want further training in the ways of Dragon Age the Veilguard, then there's only one path to follow: IGN.